Okay, so for our presentation, my group covered sea level rise and specifically its effects on the South Pacific Islands. Um, so for a bit of background first, sea levels have been rising across the globe and South Pacific Islands are at a great risk due to their natural geography. As you can see, a map of the Pacific Islands is shown on the right here, and their natural geography includes like coral reefs and obviously their proximity to sea level. These countries are susceptible to the long-term effects of climate change. And according to the USGC, sea level in the Western Pacific has been increasing at a rate 2 to 3 times the global average. And the global average can be seen in this graph on the left, where you can notice a steady increase in the global sea level. Um, and this results in an almost zero point 0.3 meters of net rise since 1990s. So tons of negative effects are becoming present as this issue continues to become more severe, and these Pacific Island nations are at a greater risk. With this graph here, these are some of the nations that also could be considered a part of the South Pacific Islands. And you can notice a pattern how the areas that are at the highest hazard index are either direct islands or they're along the coast. You can notice the entirety of the Philippines is in red, as well this coast as the coast along Malaysia, Indonesia, as well as Vietnam. And some of these negative effects include rising temperatures, obviously rising sea levels, um, and severe weather events, which we'll get into more later in the presentation. So in this slideshow, we will go over how the sea levels affect people and citizens, physical land, and the future. So starting off with the first bullet, people and citizens, which includes society, healthcare, infrastructure, and food. So starting with society, first off, we have fishermen and farmers, and these groups are at risk because they would probably have to migrate somewhere. With the rising sea levels, their industry is affected and is at great risk because for the fishermen, obviously with the rising sea levels, um, the fish could get displaced, their fishing areas could get destroyed, they might not have anywhere to go. And with farmers, their soil could become ruined by the rising sea levels. It could get completely destroyed, or it could get flooded with salt water, which causes the soil to become infertile and they can't grow any crops there. Next, we have government officials, and they're at risk because they would need to create policies to reduce the country's carbon emissions and battle climate change, as the country's actions and infrastructure have a direct impact on climate change, and then therefore the climate change comes back and affects them with the rising sea levels. They would also have to plan out infrastructure, and they might need to invest in that can protect the citizens against flooding. So some infrastructure would include bridges, walls, or drainages around the city and country, and there's also the fear that their national sovereignty is at risk. So they're afraid they're feeling less like a nation because they're actively losing land and like the physical aspect of having a nation just isn't there anymore as the sea levels begin to rise. Next, we have the actual cities in the country. These cities can be destroyed due to the rising temperatures or extreme weather conditions due to climate change, which includes typhoons and flooding or just like extreme heat, which makes it areas inhabitable to live in. Then we have the citizens, and the citizens often feel as if they're losing their culture as it is tied to the physical land. And that is a big thing you can see in the cultures, specifically in the South Pacific Islands. They feel a spiritual connection to nature and like all the deep-rooted history they have on the island. And if they're actively losing it, it feels like they are losing their identity. And there's also the possibility of having to migrate to another country or a different part of the land. So that includes like leaving their home, their culture, like something they feel so deeply connected to. They're like losing a part of themselves. Next, we have the tourists. There would be decreased visitation to these countries due to the lack of resources and the destruction of vacation spots. Being islands, they do have a lot of beaches and they do make them a popular vacation spot often. And with the beaches gone or ruined, obviously no one's going to want to visit them. And this direct has a direct impact on the economy as one, it's a loss of infrastructure, it's a loss of jobs, um, and there's a loss of a big market with the tourists. So with the climate change, it feels like every single sector of the country is being affected.
Sea level rise impacts healthcare in many ways. One important way is that it affects the actual medical facilities that people get treated in. With sea level rise, buildings on the shoreline are heavily affected and can easily be damaged. Unfortunately, in a study done on small island countries, data showed that of the countries that were researched, 61.5% of medical facilities on these islands are within 500 meters of the coast. As you can see in the diagram from the PowerPoint, if hospital buildings are on the shoreline, they could easily get washed away, which would cause less hospital buildings. If there are no hospital buildings, there are no places to get healthcare or for people to get treated. Another important way Another important way sea level rise impacts healthcare is that it can bring disease, including dengue and malaria. Both of these diseases are spread by mosquitoes, which is why there's a mosquito on our presentation. These insects are attracted to water, so an increase in standing water would cause more mosquitoes to come, increasing the breeding ground for these diseases. As you can see in the chart on our presentation, this is how mosquito diseases occur. Because they try to avoid standing water, higher levels cause more of them to fly around, causing them to be able to reproduce, feed on someone's blood, infect the host, which then, as you can see, spreads throughout the human population. Another important thing sea level rise impacts on Pacific Islands is infrastructure. Some infrastructure on Pacific Islands affected by sea level rise include seawalls, breakwaters, and groins. In these pictures, these are all infrastructures that are put around islands to protect them against things like tides, sediment, and to overall protect the inland area. However, if sea level keeps rising, these will not be effective, as the water will simply overcome the infrastructure and will defeat the purposes they have to protect the people and how they live. Lastly, sea level rise also affects the food that citizens are able to eat. When weather conditions occur that cause sea level to rise, fish habitats are affected because they are not the same as before. With fish habitats affected, fish either die or migrate elsewhere, making the common food for inland villagers disappear. Sea level rise also affects the crops villagers grow from saltwater intrusion. With higher sea levels, salt and fresh water are more likely to mix. Because of this, the water that gets inland gets into the soil where crops grow, killing the crops and reducing the food citizens have access to. In the diagram shown, you can see the process of saltwater intrusion for crops. Sea level rise washes into the marsh plants, which causes marsh migration. This marsh migration covers the agricultural soil, plugging it up and changing the soil chemistry. This kills the crops and causes citizens to not have food. So this is how people and citizens are affected by sea level rise.
Now I'm going to talk about how climate change is affecting the future of the South Pacific Islands. So even though the South Pacific Islands are one of the smaller contributors of carbon, they are one of the locations that are at a higher risk of climate change. This is due to climate change ultimately increasing the overall sea level rise. And on this graph, you can see how much sea level rise has actually increased from 1995 to around 2020. I would say this change is around 9 centimeters, maybe. But even though that this change is measured in millimeters, it still is very significant to the future of these islands. Even the slight change in sea level can induce an increased flooding on the islands, and because they are low-lying systems, these islands are more susceptible to the flooding impacts. Also, hurricane conditions will become more extreme due to an increase in wind and rainfall. This will not only mean that they're going to happen more frequently, but also more severely. Lastly, because these factors, they can actually result in coastal erosion, which is where areas where it might have lots of sand or rock will eventually erode and lead to these shores and the houses on these shores being destroyed. So all these factors can contribute to a future of the islands being unstable. And this is obviously not good because of all the people residing on these islands. So they're going to have to find a way to either cope with this or relocate to somewhere else, which brings me to my next point, the potential solutions of what is being done to address climate change. So one of the key things that the islanders are trying to do is to provide programs to future students at colleges and universities. And for example, the Partnership for Advanced Marine and Environmental Science Training for Pacific Islanders and Pacific Adaptation to Climate Change and Resilience Building, which you can see in this picture down below. These programs are basically educating these students and allowing them to basically get first or hands-on experience to create change or awareness on the topic of climate change, which is very important to these islanders because it can change their entire future. And by raising awareness, they're able to act on this issue, basically. And action is one of the key things that needs to happen in order to prevent climate change. And lastly, another way that the islanders are basically trying to solve climate change, well, adjust to it, I would say, is by finding areas that they can relocate to if conditions do become very severe. This way they'll have a home still and they'll be able to live in the same area without having to cope with all of the hurricanes and the extremities of climate change. Thank you for listening to our presentation on the impacts of climate change and on the South Pacific Islands.